Hello and welcome everyone to CGTN's live roundtable dialogue on how we can bridge the gap between civilizations on the sidelines of the Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations, which kicked off today here in Beijing. We know that Mesopotamia, China, Egypt, India, these are the cradles of civilization. Agriculture sprouted from these four places and then it spread across the Eurasian landmass, sparking a flow of dialogue, of commerce, of trade, of ideas all across the Eurasian continent. So we are going to take you back through time, talk about the past, present, and future in terms of how agriculture, the foundation of commerce, the foundation of civilizations, how agriculture can bridge the gap between civilizations. We've got a fantastic panel for you today to discuss this topic. Sitting right next to me is Helen Hanhua from the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies at Renmin University. Next to Helen, it's Professor David Bartosz from the Beijing Foreign Studies University. And then next to Professor Bartosz is Professor Zhang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. So welcome to all three of you.
Thank you.
Now, the four cradles of civilization that we talked about, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, India, these, of course, are very crucial in terms of agriculture's development to the world. And we often talk about the three previous industrial revolutions in the past 3 centuries. And, of course, we are enamored with the fourth industrial revolution as well in terms of big data, in terms of robotics, artificial intelligence, neurotics, deep learning, etc. But we have to remember the first revolution that hit mankind. This is very important because without this very first revolution, the agricultural revolution, we would not be where we are today. So let's take a closer look in terms of how humans went from roaming the earth to taming the earth. Take a look.
Our common ancestors, Homo sapiens, lived as small bands of hunter-gatherers. It's said that agriculture first began in the Middle East at the time of the Neolithic Revolution. The new way of life spread quickly as people found it attractive and productive. Humans were able to remain settled more permanently. Civilizations began to form in many regions of the world. Writing, mathematics, and arts emerged. Our ancestors also created more sophisticated tools such as iron and bronzeware that help upgrade agriculture into larger scales. Different civilizations began to interact, collide, and blend with the expansion of societies. Trade of agricultural products played as a main carrier of cultural exchanges in the process. Taking China, for example, rice, tea, and silk were carried to the west through the Asian Silk Road. Fruits such as grapes and granadas were also brought into China. More importantly, sciences and technologies transmitted along the routes. Accompanying the interactions were also philosophies and religions. The increased contact have made mankind more connected than ever before.
All right, so in terms of going from hunter-gatherers to where we are today, certainly quite a long process, but nonetheless progress. Indeed, let's bring in our panel to discuss this. Helen, I want to start with you. I mentioned the 4 areas where agriculture started here in China, obviously the Yangtze, as well as the Yellow River in Egypt.
The Delta River.
Exactly. Yeah. In Egypt, the Nile. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And of course, in India, the Indus and the Ganges. So in terms of agriculture's role in promoting civilizational exchange, what do you think that is? Because often it might be in the back of our minds, right? We don't think about this too often.
Yeah, so I'm really happy that we can go back to the roots or the foundation of civilizations, which is not just a term or terminology of culture exchange, ideas exchange, or trade activities among the countries and nations and the continents. It's more like the first and the foremost, the form of exchanging, of promoting the exchange among people. So that is very important that we can go back to the root. And in my opinion, there is a Chinese proverb saying that only when people can have sufficient food and clothing can we talk about, the protocol of good manners as well as the ideas of food for thought, as we put it. So food or agriculture development is certainly the cornerstone of civilizations and the further development of like ideas of change
Yeah.
among the nations and the cultures.
Yeah. What do you think, Professor Bartosz? Because Helen mentioned, progress and ideas, and I almost feel agriculture, in a sense, it is the liberation of the human mind, because we don't have to think about where our next meal will be. We don't need to go out and hunt for certain things or forage for certain things.
It's the starting point of civilization and of culture.
Yeah.
Even the very word culture goes back to the meaning of agriculture, because cultura, the Latin word, is directly related to working with the soil, to cultivate the soil. And then there was this transfer to the cultivation of mind, of our soul, of ourselves as human beings, to cultivate. Also, technology is part of culture, to refine technologies, to cultivate, in the sense of arts, music, and so forth, science, thought. In a very long run, philosophy wouldn't be possible without agriculture, right? Because then we have the time, we have this distribution of labor occurs, cities emerge, right? People have can distribute labors, can develop more complex societies. Also the banking system, if we look back, starts in ancient Sumeria. The first banks were the temples who provided loans for the peasants. So, and also in China, I think the economy right from the start is very, very much related to agriculture, to the whole family system is related to agriculture and early economic thought. And so I think this is the very basis of civilization and of culture.
Yeah.
So that's the important topic to start with.
I think some of the earliest Chinese characters were based on agriculture, if I'm not mistaken, Professor. And Professor Bartosz spoke about technology. Professor Gong, I want to ask you in terms of some of the key ancient agricultural technologies that we saw in these 4 regions. What do you think they are? I mean, off the top of my mind, I can think about perhaps the heavy plow that we saw being invented in the Han Dynasty, which is pretty darn effective when it comes to being effective on labor.
Well, I mean, agriculture is extremely important. Everything comes from the Mother Earth. Today, either you plant it or you mine it. And before human beings start to mining things, we plant things. So I think, this, particularly it's true in Chinese history. We people here in China are very much into making foods, cooking foods, and we are connoisseurs. We really love eating. The Chinese culture is all about eating. And many of the inventions, you look at the history of Chinese inventions, many of them are related to food and agriculture. For example, rice, it's invented here in China. And I think as well as things that are related to cultivating. A lot of tools are also here invented in China. And the other agricultural products also invented in China. So, this civilization has a long history of inventing things related to agriculture. And we are fundamentally, especially the ethnic Han history is fundamentally about planting and cultivating. So this is our very root. And it's extremely important looking back.
I mean, Helen, we can't talk about the exchange of civilizations on the Eurasian landmass without touching upon the Silk Road.
Of
right?
course.
So, I mean, this is not just an exchange of goods and products, but lots of agricultural technologies being spread on the Silk Road as well, ideas also. So give us a sense of the importance of the Silk Road in bridging this gap between civilizations, in particular with regards to agriculture.
Yeah, I'm happy you raised this, because when we talk about the modern day Belt and Road Initiative, we can't help looking back to the history of the ancient Silk Road and why it is called Silk Road, because the silk is one of the China's most production at that time. Even for today, China is still dominating the production of the silk in the world. So Silk Road, as well as it is also called the Tea Road, or sometimes tea and horse road, because of the trading activities mainly is built around the food and also the other agricultural products China and the other countries provided to each other and want to share with each other. For example, when we discussed the modern technology these days, I just can't help thinking of a very long-lasting technology that China is contributed to the world and is still lasting till today. It's about the Silk silkworms. And around the silkworms, people, especially the farmers, they grow the mulberry trees, to nurture the silkworms. And the silkworms are, feeding this, the fishes in the ponds as well. So it is a very original and the natural ecosystems China's farmers built almost 2,000 years ago to help contribute to the flourishing and the development of Asian Silk Road. And this spirit, as well as the product, is continuing developed. It's like a sustainable growth even till today.
Yeah. I want to get your perspective, Professor Bartosz, on the other side of the Eurasian landmass, because to me it seems like silk is almost a culture carrier from one side of the landmass to the other. This used to be a medium of exchange. It used to be sort of a vivid way to express your artistic passions as well. So what do you think from the European perspective?
Yeah, I think silk pretty much has always been a symbol of the Han people, starting from ancient Greece. The ancient Greek word for China was serike, which is directly related to silk. It sounds a little bit like the word Chinese word serike. So right from the beginning, Chinese people were identified with that special invention, which is, of course, related to the art of refinement or cultivation of life processes. So in this case, silkworms, a very special feature of Chinese civilization. Although we also know that later on the art was spread to other civilizations, but it's still until today very much identified with China. And I think another aspect here, which you also have mentioned, which is important here to talk about, is that China somehow, for thousands of years, managed to create, comparatively, compared to other civilizations, managed to create what I call self-recreational economies on that basis, focusing on agriculture, creating sustainable ways of recreation. This is for the soil. The most important thing is that soil can absorb new life energies. So you have to invent some methods how to do that. And I think this also then later on led to forms of self-organization of the Chinese nation, which then led to certain kind of self-balanced, self-recreational forms of economy. And I think this is still, even today, the important gift that China can and this wisdom related to this, what China can present to the world, and which also the world should start to absorb. This idea of self-recreational economies. Because if we look at many Indo-European-speaking language family-based civilizations, there's always this problem, is somehow half-nomadic. There's always this violent expansion which somehow is needed to foster their economies. And this is not working. It's not sustainable and will not work in today's global family of civilization. In that context, this cannot work. We need another. So
we're talking about self-sustaining agricultural models thousands of years back.
And their influence on economic thought. That the most important thing is to create a self-sustainable economy first.
Yeah. David, hold that thought, because we are going to sort of dial the clock back is what we've been doing, but we want to push the clock forward and talk more about modern agriculture, because with the advent of technology, with the speed of communications these days, we've seen modern agriculture technology really progressing quite rapidly in the past few decades in the post-war years. From east to west, from north to south, it's pretty easy to share agriculture technology in modern times. So let's take a look at the progress made so far.
Hybrid rice is known as the fifth invention in the world. It's produced by crossbreeding different kinds of rice and was developed by Chinese scientists led by Yuan Longping in 1974. 2 years later, China widely began growing hybrid rice, also known as super rice. According to reports from the International Rice Forum, hybrid rice was first introduced overseas to the United States in 1979. The crop is now grown in more than 30 countries and regions, with total acreage surpassing 7 million hectares. On May 9th, a new record was set by 2 new super rice strains with yields of over 13 metric tons per hectare and more than 13.5 metric tons per hectare, respectively. It is expected to help China maintain its largely self-sufficient supply of rice, a staple food for more than 60% of its population over the next few decades. Non-soil cultivation methods are another modern mode of factory-style vegetable production. Compared with traditional soil planting, these tomatoes can have 5 times as much output with greater control over quality. It has proven to be safe in many countries such as China, Germany, the US, as well as Israel, which has decades of planting with leading technologies. Technicians are cycling the nutritional liquid without discharge to the outside world. It can reduce the use of pesticides by over 50%. Many companies in Beijing are trying this mode of production. These products have already entered the Beijing market. Exchange of civilizations are helping modern agriculture develop at much faster speed. From east to west, more and more agricultural products are changing the world's landscape.
So with modern agricultural techniques, we are redefining, reframing what it is in terms of farming these days. Now you can farm pretty much without soil. You can farm without light as well, natural sunlight that is. You can do artificial lighting. So Welcome back. So before we left you, we were talking about how China was exporting ideas and products through the Silk Road, but certainly this is not just a one-way street. It is definitely a two-way street. Let's bring in Professor Gong to talk more about this in terms of what were some of the ideas and products that China received from the rest of the Eurasian landmass through the Silk Road.
Certainly, there are great products got into China in history. For example, some underground crops like peanuts and potatoes, for example.
Which we take for granted today.
Potato is actually a very important crop, right? And saves people's life.
Yeah.
Right.
And also a lot of spices. Believe it or not, spices, peppers, stuff from Mexico, from South America. You know, these great spices all come from overseas. And also, I think some vegetables like tomato, I think is alien here, right? So I think also cucumbers also from other countries. So I think there's a whole range of stuff, great stuff. You know, actually came from outside our country.
Sesame seeds, pomegranate, also imported from Central Asia. So lots that China took in and then made it into its own cuisine, this sort of fusion. You know, in our report that we just ran, we were talking about the marvels of modern technology. You now don't need natural lighting to farm. You don't need soil to farm. And we now have better yields as well. But I think something that Asian civilizations, you can call it, but just partners in this region can all work on is fighting hunger. Because even though we are in the 21st century, this is still an issue. The latest report from the UN's Agriculture Organization, it actually shows that hunger is on the rise since 2015. I mean, overall, we've made great progress in the past few decades, but for some reason, this is ticking up since 2015. In Asia, it's decreasing. But still, it's 11% of Asia's population. That's 500 million plus people that still goes hungry every day in this part of the world. I want to get your thoughts first, Helen, in terms of why that is, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do about it. But why is that?
Yeah, according to UN SDG for 2030, there is definitely a goal to alleviate the poverty and let people well fed by that year, meaning that the people who are still suffering not from the sufficient food is still growing because of the growing and of the population and also the decreasing amount of the arable land, not only for China, but probably for Asian countries, because Asian countries are facing still the largest growth of the population in terms of the whole picture. So I think governments in Asian countries are facing the same challenges. So it's time and it's very necessary for the Asian cultures to work again together. It's not only a two-way street now. It's like we all mixed together in terms of the agriculture development, utilizing modern technologies and working together to tackle this kind of problems. You mentioned the modern technologies to be used, like the solar panels, to help grow and increase the amount of productivities, not only for the crops, but maybe for the freshwater food as well. This is also not only from China alone, but the Asian countries which has the ample resources of water, we can work together too.
Yeah, so Professor Gong, what do you think on this? Should there be more policy coordination between governments on the Eurasian landmass in terms of dealing with this issue? How should Asian civilizations or countries come together?
Of course. I think in many countries today, agriculture is still very much susceptible to Mother Nature. You know, what you get bad weather, you get some natural disasters, then some countries will get into problem in terms of food security. Another actually very important reason, in my view, is the population increase. You know, you see in some developing countries, especially I think in Africa, in Middle East, for example, the population increase is actually very rapid. And so the food production yield has to be, the increase in that has to be keeping up with the population increase. And certainly that's a tall order. In these countries, the population increase very fast. And I think several years back, there's also this issue of using some food grains like corn to transform into energy products. For example, ethanol was very big in the United States, and that caused a world shortage of corn on the international market, and this has repercussions in the Middle East as well as in Africa. These are some of the reasons. Also, I think crop yield is also or can also be greatly enhanced by using fertilizers. If you look at the crop yield in Africa, for example, compared here in China, there's a big difference. And the difference is, I think, a lot of it is attributed to the use of fertilizers. Now, some of the fertilizers, for example, potash, is highly concentrated in a few countries, and the price is very, very high. They are concentrated, for example, in Saskatchewan province in Canada, in Russia, in Ukraine, and that's about it. So the use of these very good fertilizers, to a large extent, is very limited. I think even here in China, if you look at the 3 main ingredients of fertilizers, the ratio is not optimal because of the high price of potash, and it's underused, and that alone in countries like Africa and other countries. So, I think these are the issues that the countries can work together to address. And in many aspects that I mentioned here, there's a room for cooperation between countries and also a role played by international organizations like the United Nations and such.
I mean, there should be, Professor Bartosz, I feel, free-flow sharing of technology and information on this front in terms of dealing with Asia's population bulge, especially what we see in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And in terms of technologies, do you think that can also help with the situation? Because now we see here in China, for example, vertical farms. We see over in North America as well in terms of saving land, it's less polluting. What do you think?
I think this is a very important, very good developments. So everything which saves energy or which helps us to save the soil or to enable the soil, the natural soil, to recreate and takes away the pressure of that most precious good that we have. The soil is much more precious than gold or whatever some people think is important. So whatever helps in this situation is in terms of technology is very helpful. But on the other hand, I also think we have to think about our ways of consumption. We have to cultivate our way of consumption, our way of consuming, because in the 20th century there was this idea, food should be very cheap. Many people in the West got overweight. The production methods were based on the exploitation of soil. And I think this is somehow related. So our digestion system, our stomachs, and the soil, they are complementary. They belong together. And you see there's more and more people getting sick because they eat too much or they eat wrong things. And at the same time, also the natural environment is spoiled by this way of seeing the soil just as some kind of material to consume and to create mere profit. That's not. We have to have a change of mind. So
change your mind.
So technology is one aspect, and the other aspect is to also to cultivate ourselves again.
That's a tough sale. Come on. That's a tough
but
sale.
It's necessary.
Especially in China.
But there is there is a book, I forgot the author. It's very old. It's 80 years old. He was talking about Western technology and outer technology and Eastern inner technology. And of course now we have a reverse. Of course, Asia has absorbed all these technologies and even developed them further on. So they are Asian now. But at the same time, also Western people are starting to be acquainted with these inner technologies, the self-control, self-cultivation, whatever Chinese traditions, Chinese traditional medicine, all these things. And I think this belongs together in a sense. So the inside, our bodies and the hard technology, we should find a way to balance this. And it starts with us. It starts with the single human being and with families and the way we consume, the way we behave towards Mother Nature. And this is all our own decisions.
But I mean, Helen, Professor Bartosz brings up an interesting point, because if we have the populations of Asia and we consume the same level as we see in North America and Europe, that's not sustainable for Mother Nature. It's simply not.
That's right.
So I'm just wondering, because this region is home to 60% of the population, and the population is growing more affluent. So does that force innovation when it comes to modern agriculture? For example, from China, from India, from Indonesia, these growing populations, it forces innovation on modern agriculture, and that can can be shared across the rest of the world. Can Asia lead the charge on this front?
I think it's both ways. It's not just one way like forced innovation. Sometimes it's more like proactive innovation all the way in the history through now. So yes, of course, modern technology can play a even bigger role in this, cultivation and agriculture development, and to meet the human needs. And at the same time, I think humans are creative and innovative enough, not only talk to the inner body, but also to meet the societal as well as the natural needs. To see what kind of food and what kind of culture we need to nurture, not only this generation of people, but also leave to the next and the next generations. There is a post going viral these days on the internet. I don't know whether you guys have read it or not. The question is about how China is able to feed a population as large as 1.4 billion people to meet the Chinese government or people's own perspective or goal as well-fed.
Yeah.
And it says that in China, Chinese farmers are really creative from the history, that they are creating some, from the satellite TV pictures, they're very creative by having those,
I saw that. Yeah.
The coastline, the houses and the cages to be built so that the farmers, the Chinese, can have more sufficient food.
Yeah, well, here's a point. I think the biggest guarantee to food safety...
Professor, you're going to have to wrap up this point in about 10 seconds because we're going to have to talk about the future. There's a lot to talk about. 10 seconds.
It's very important. The biggest guarantee to food security is world peace.
Yeah.
I think the Earth is able to feed all the people on Earth. As long as there's peace, there's free trade, there's enough food for everyone. So I think the most important thing is world peace. Free trade and world peace guarantee is the biggest guarantee of food safety.
I mean, this global peace should be what unites us all. It's much greater, I think, than geopolitical maneuvering. And free trade and peace. All right, we're going to leave it there. But we are going to talk about the future of agriculture because right now what we're seeing is this growing trend of organic farmlands springing all around the world. And right now we are seeing organic products, organic sales, organic farmland. That is all at record highs in the past few decades, according to the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture. Let's take a closer look.
The year 2017 was a record year for organic agriculture, with the global market at over $90 billion. The United States led the market share with nearly $50 billion, followed by Germany, France, and China. 2017 continued to show double-digit growth rates, especially in Europe. The French organic market grew by 18%. The Swiss spent the most on organic food, and Denmark had the highest organic market share. Nearly 3 million organic producers were reported in 2017. That's a 5% increase year on year. The organic farmland increased to nearly 70 million hectares, the largest growth ever recorded. Since 2010, the organic area has grown by over 30 million hectares.
So we are indeed seeing a growing health consciousness among consumers all around the world today, from developing to developed countries. So, Helen, I want to get to you as the first question because throughout our history, we really were eating organic foods most of the time. It's really during the post-war period when we had chemicals and various synthetic chemicals that we see this going on. So are we seeing a trend back to, because of strong consumer demand, much more organic products? And can we replace what we eat right now with mostly organic products?
Defining, the more organic, the word organic in the modern terms, like I just said, I think, even Chinese farmers now providing to Chinese people on the table the variety, the rich variety of food, like seafood or freshwater food we call it today. I think that even for the farmers to raise this food near the coastline from Zhejiang province all the way to Guangdong province, I still regard them as organic food because they are from fresh waters, and that the way all the approaches to raise them is in a much organic way, like we're introducing the modern technologies like the solar panel, as well as we create a it's a man-made ecosystem, but it is a way of utilizing different sources the Mother Nature has given to us.
Self-sustaining, again, this concept of self-sustaining.
It's also self-sustaining. It's a sustainable growth. So the food table the Chinese people are enjoying right now is really a very diverse food. That can you imagine that Chinese people are consuming about over 50% of the seafood or fresh food in the world? So that's a lot of. That's quite a big amount, but we are still affordable to that. We are not suffering from the high price. So I think this kind of modern organic way need to be further developed and explored so that more different ecosystems can be built to adapt to the different natural resources, geography, conditions as well.
Yeah. Speaking of higher prices, though, Professor Bartosz, Professor Gong touched upon this climate change and its impact on food. And this is something that Asian countries and partners need to work together a lot more on as well, because going down the road in the next few decades, from salinity issues, from desertification, from rising water levels elsewhere, I mean, the Asian Development Bank is predicting that countries like Vietnam and Thailand, traditional rice-growing countries, they're going to see rising sea levels. That's going to knock out 50% perhaps of their rice production. That could be, I mean, it's huge implications for supply and for prices as well. So what more can Asian partners and peers do to combat climate change together?
I think one of the most important things is that we, in Asia, but also Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia, and in the world as a whole, that we grow together into a global civilization. And one of the core characteristics of civilization is that civilization is always started by dealing with certain kind of environmental problems, right? There's the regulation of the waters by Dayu, by the Chinese, but also other Asian civilizations, ancient Persia or Iran or India. They all based on this idea that there some capable people managed waters or manage societies in a way that they became self-sustainable and they could flourish. And I think what we have to do is we have to remember that core meaning of civilization and then try to foster that dialogue, which is also literally starting today here in Beijing, this Asian dialogue, and we make use of our ancient knowledge, but also of our evolved scientific views, how to deal with all these kind of problems specifically. So we have to have a lot of communication, a lot of dialogue going on, and we have to share, as you said, as you mentioned, we have to share freely the information because it's about our survival.
But I mean,
there's a crucial issue, right?
That's very true. But Professor Gong, there's a lot of developing countries in Asia as well, and they might say, yes, we agree with the issues that we have to deal with for climate change, but hey, we haven't gone up to that development stage yet, so you got to give us some more time. What do you say to countries like this, and can there be support from more developed countries towards these developing Asian countries to tackle this?
Well, that's the Paris Accord is all about, actually. They work out a system where some developing countries are entitled to some financial compensations for reducing their pollutions. They got on per capita basis a small quota compared to developed countries. This is the international community that's been working towards. And we have agreement on the table, but as you know, there's one country in the world that doesn't sign it.
It's a pretty big country too.
Right. So I think when it comes to Asian countries, and we have several platforms here in Asia, for example, United Nations, Asia Pacific Development Forum. I mean, these forums like this, organizations like this, I think are very good platforms to talk about these things, work out solutions together. And also I think these things can be done on a regional basis. We have APEC, for example, we have other sort of regional organizations, platforms and forums to address these issues. So I think as long as these things are discussed through mutual dialogues and addressed in a sort of a harmonious way, I think we're okay. I don't see a existential challenge here. We face some problem. There's a climate change. There's no doubt about it. But I think there are plenty of solutions on the table that we can address these issues. It's not going to threaten our fundamental existence.
I also think today President Xi Jinping mentioned, quoted a Taoist term, a Taoist phrase. He said, 道法自然. And this was quite interesting because I think if, as you say, if we manage to come together, if we foster dialogue, I think maybe things will fall into place. You know, if we connect, we will have these Dao Fa Zhen means the regulating principle of Dao is self-sowing. So if we work together, a solution will come about.
Yeah.
So I think that's a Chinese wisdom, but I think it's pretty much related to the problem itself, also.
Yes.
All these global environmental issues.
And like you said, in terms of mindset, we should really get ourselves out of the mindset of the clash of civilizations we've been talking about the past few days. Really about dialogue of civilizations, especially in this part of the region.
The whole talk's not helpful because it's not an option.
It is not an option based on all the common challenges.
So we only have this one. We only have this one shot. We have to dialogue, to communicate. That's our only one shot that we have.
Bringing it back to agriculture, Helen, do you think we can achieve that optimal balance in terms of more nutritious food, less polluting to the environment, higher yields on the agriculture front? Because, I mean, this is, again, it's the foundation of stability in society. When you have stable societies, then you can have economic development and prosperity going forward.
Yeah.
Can we achieve that trinity based on where we stand right now?
I believe there will be ups and downs during the whole process, but I'm confident, given our 5,000 years of history in developing agriculture into a leading nation and the leading continent in terms of the Asian civilizations of the agriculture development. So I personally am very confident in pursuing that goal in the future. And speaking of this 道法自然, I quite agree with you, and I think the dialogue is just a starting point of the civilizations to exchange further ideas, but also to exchange of the act, not only the word, not only the ideas, but also the actions. Bring us back to the policy coordination you just mentioned in the agricultural development, and in the further, to further enhance the exchange of civilizations and the kind of mix of civilizations, so that all the parties involved can utilize the modern technologies. I think policy coordination is still very important. It will bring out this kind of 道法自然at the end of today, but we need to do some things proactively, like to share the modern technologies from the internet, from blockchain, from the artificial intelligence you just mentioned. But still, the Asian countries, because most of them are still developing countries, so policy coordination to reach the ultimate goal at the end of the day, the harmonious society, and the people who are satisfied with the well-fed, because food-related culture is such a fundamental essence in our cultures. So I think people need to coordinate well.
But I think it's also about the single individual.
Yeah.
We also have to raise awareness for the responsibility of every single individual human being. And of course, this can also be done in terms of education at schools, right?
Yes.
But the responsibility, everybody's responsible.
That's a very good point. Yeah. So that not only the society, but also the individuals involved can work together to reach that goal.
Are you seeing any concrete examples, Professor Gong, in terms of along the Belt and Road countries, what we are seeing in terms of agricultural exchanges? Southern Asia, for example, Western Asia, these regions really still do have food security issues. So in terms of dialogue, in terms of people-to-people exchanges, technology exchanges in Belt and Road countries, what are you seeing on the agriculture?
I have plenty of examples in Africa, for example. Not necessarily on the Silk Road, but in Africa. I know there are Chinese companies. Actually, China has been helping African countries on agricultural technologies, going back many, many years, in the 1970s. But today, that tradition is still ongoing, but more on a sort of a market basis, not necessarily on an international assistance programs basis. I know, for example, there are companies here in China going to some African countries to lease the land, for example, to do sort of a more highly productive agriculture business, help locals to turn products into more of a commercial products and get into the export business by adding value. These activities, I think, are two-way streets. It provides opportunities here in China. enhance our exports, enhance our technology transfer, but also increasing jobs, creating jobs in Africa, and also increasing wealth in Africa. So I think this is a very good recipe as I see it. So I think the agricultural exchanges is definitely a very important theme. Although we tend to sort of ignore agriculture, don't think it's very important, but I think it's a very, still a very important, also a very viable means of exchange, as well as seeking commercial opportunities in China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. And going down the road, Helen, and this is for all of you, are there specific technologies you see right now that could potentially be game changers on the agricultural front? I mean, I mentioned, for example, vertical farming, which I'm pretty excited about. We can pretty much go from farming in the rural areas now to the urban areas and save a lot of space. But that's just my thought. What do you think, Helen?
I think agriculture is such an amazing means, to enhance the culture, civilizations, the dialogue, not only the dialogue, but also the activities. So I'm still thinking of, we need to borrow the wisdom from our ancestors in terms of building, different ecosystem, because agriculture is such a means that relies on the Mother Nature heavily. So we need to work with Mother Nature in a more harmonious way, so that we need to build a different ecosystem, just not as the ecosystem I just mentioned, maybe different ecosystems by utilizing different modern technologies. For example, the Internet Plus, the artificial intelligence enhanced, or the blockchain secured, so that every food, every mouse of food we eat, we know where it is from.
Yeah.
So different technologies being used in different ecosystems, that is the part that I'm looking forward to.
I mean, essentially, the digitization of agriculture, Professor Bartosz, is sort of the elimination of perhaps negative effects we see from Mother Nature, the constraining effects, I should say. We got to wrap up again in 10, 15 seconds. So it's a big question, but still.
I can't go into detail here, but I would encourage also Asian researchers also to check. There are some Germany, for example, has a history of more than 100 years of eco-friendly agriculture, and there are little small companies, very special ways, which I can't explain here in detail, but they are actually used already for 20, 30 years, but they are not big players. But actually, I think some of their ideas would be very beneficial if being combined with these elements which you are addressing. So there's a lot more potential, and we should be very creative, very open to also to try new ideas. There's a lot of new ideas if you do research the last 100 years of eco-friendly agriculture. In Germany, you will find a lot of gemstones, which would be very beneficial.
My biggest specs on biotechnology. I might as well take the opportunity to do some promotion for genetically alternative foods. I think it's a wonderful technology. People have some misconception about these, and I think that's totally wrong. These are great technologies. These are safe foods. And it greatly enhances productivity, right? And I think it's going to feed a lot of people. And speaking of food security, that's the answer. That's one of the answers.
Yeah. Okay. We are going to leave it there.
I have a different opinion.
Okay.
But that's perhaps we're not.
Next episode.
There's certainly a lot to discuss because this is the fabric. This is the foundation of society in terms of agriculture. Some very fascinating insights today. We've talked about the mindset in terms of how human beings can change their mindset and cooperate more in agriculture, as well as to modern technologies, futuristic technologies that can ensure that we have stability in our societies going forward. So a fantastic discussion. Thank you to all three of you, Helen Hanhua from the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies at Renmin University, Professor David Bartosz from the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and of course, Professor Zhang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. Many thanks to all three of you. Now, don't go anywhere, because tomorrow at 16 Beijing time, 8 GMT, we will give you the highlights, the key points from this panel discussion on how agriculture really can bridge the gap between civilizations. So you want to tune into that. I mean, we had 40, 50 minutes of discussion here, but in that episode, you'll see we'll pick apart in terms of what you need to take away the most. So do join us on Global Business tomorrow for that. But for now, I am Michael Wong in Beijing. The Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations is taking place right here in Beijing starting today. So do look out for that and how we can further promote more dialogue, exchanges, and cooperation across the Eurasian landmass and indeed across the world as we enter into these uncertain times it's certainly very, very necessary. But for now, we are going to leave you. We'll see you again later.